Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 289, Amanda Nunes versus Irene Aldana. We saw some crazy finishes. We saw some great performances. We saw the GOAT of women's MMA retire. But we also saw some very poor performances and some terrible losses by certain fighters on the card. And I am going to break down who I believe should be cut from the UFC after their performance at UFC 289. Now, before I get into who I believe should be cut from UFC 289, we're going to start with honorable mentions, and then I'm going to get into the actual list. The honorable mentions are kind of just fighters that I think are fringe. Maybe they could be cut, but really maybe the UFC should give them one more chance. But before I get into that, comment down below, who do you believe should be cut from the UFC after their performance at UFC 289? Also, I have to mention this every time I make one of these videos. I'm not wishing anyone out of a job. I have no impact on UFC cuts. But this video is more about who belongs in the UFC versus who does not belong in the UFC. And I actually think my last cut, I'm going to save the best for last, I think is actually going to shock a lot of you. But if you watch any amount of my content, it won't surprise you at all. Starting off with the first honorable mention, and honestly, I think we should give him one more chance, but I wanted to talk about him on this list, and that is David Dvorak, a top 15 ranked flyweight. He's on a 3-fight losing streak now. And Steve Erceg came in on short notice, a couple days notice, with limited experience, and beat David Dvorak. Clearly won the second round, hurt him badly, almost finished him in the second round. And then in the third round, it just seemed like Steve Erceg wanted it more. And granted, Steve Erceg, overperformed for sure. And, not all the best guys are just strictly in the UFC. There's a lot of great guys outside the UFC waiting for their opportunity. But David Dvorak, he's on a 3-fight losing streak. He loses to a guy who's 9-1, who's fought relatively inexperienced competition, almost got finished in the second round, and also he's on a 3-fight losing streak. He lost to Beneil in his last performance, and then lost to Matheus Nicolau in the performance before that. All by decisions, but in the last 2 fights before this, he got dominated. He got dominated by Beneil. He got dominated by Matheus Nicolau. And the only reason I want to give him a break, and the reason I think he should get one more chance, even though he's on a 3-fight losing streak and he just lost to a debutante, he took it on short notice. He took it on a couple days' notice. He was supposed to fight Matt Schnell. He probably didn't know that much about Steve Erceg. Steve Erceg, obviously, is a top 15 caliber flyweight if he just came in and beat. I think David Dvorak was ranked number 10 going into this fight. So I want to give David Dvorak one more shot. But if you're losing to a guy who's 9-1, who's fought guys who was like 4-1, and I can't remember the exact records of the guys that Steve Erceg has beat before David Dvorak, and you're on a 3-fight losing streak, I think it's time to be probably starting to look at the UFC cutting him from the organization. Moving on to the next honorable mention, and honestly, I thought very hard about putting her on the list, and that is Irene Aldana. She fought for the women's bantamweight title in the main event of UFC 289 against Amanda Nunes. What a poor performance this was. And the only reason this is an honorable mention is because, she was fighting Amanda Nunes, but to go out there outside of one punch in the first round where she kind of hurt Amanda Nunes, she did nothing. She just plodded forward, really didn't throw any strikes. And the thing is, she was being super defensive, but she was still eating a lot of shots. She had a super high guard. She was taken down with ease. She was getting jabbed to hell. She was getting leg kicks. She was getting body shot. And she wasn't throwing anything. You're getting hit anyway. You might as well throw back and risk getting hit some more. And I just think this is one of the poorest championship performances I've seen in the UFC in a while. This was the championship equivalent to William Knight's last UFC fight. This was horrible. And the fight as a whole, I don't think it was a horrible fight. Amanda Nunes went out there and put on a display of dominance. But it just seemed like Aldana was checked out from the jump. Just super high guard, trying to survive, trying not to get finished, and not really fighting to her potential at all. And, just to have that level of takedown defense where Nunes was just throwing her to the ground and not even following her down. And I know the takedown defense got a little bit better later in the fight, but it just seemed like Amanda Nunes just started to slow down a little bit, and they were more half-hearted attempts. And then in the 5th round, she took her down when she wanted to, controlled her on the ground. She just controlled her in all aspects of this fight. Outstruck her, outworked her in the clinch, outstruck her. And, she's only lost one fight. The last fight before this, she won, but she was losing that fight to Macy Chasson. And she got an up kick to the liver, kind of a Hail Mary TKO win. And now she comes out, she gets this opportunity against Amanda Nunes. And I thought Irene Aldana had a better chance than Juliana Pena had if they did the trilogy at UFC 289. And Aldana was just a sacrificial lamb. So honestly, it wouldn't bother me if they cut her, but I don't think they're going to cut her just because of the state of the division. But to go out there and put on that type of performance, I had to put her in at least as an honorable mention. But I do understand she's fighting the greatest women's fighter of all time. And, you know, she's in a massive fight. She took it kind of on short notice. She was already training for another fight, and then a month out, it got changed from fighting Raquel Pennington to fighting Amanda Nunes. So I do kind of give her a break for that, and that's why she's an honorable mention. Moving on to my actual list of who should be cut after their performance at UFC 289. Number 3 on the list is Maria Oliveira. She took on Diana Belbita at UFC 289 on the prelims. And this was probably the worst fight on the card. This was an atrocious performance by Maria Oliveira. This was a horrible fight in general. And you look at Maria Oliveira's performance, the striking looked terrible. The grappling, she took Diana Belbita down a couple times and just laid in her guard. No ground and pound, no attempt to pass the guard, no attempt to do any damage. And then Belbita would scramble back to the feet and outstrike her and bust her up on the feet. And Maria Oliveira gassed after one round. She had no gas tank. And this was just one of the poorest performances. And this is supposed to be the elite of the elite. Is that what the UFC is supposed to be? The best versus the best? And I understand they're building some fighters and they're trying to grow some divisions. But Maria Oliveira, bottom of the barrel women's strawweight division. I mean, Diana Belbita, let's be honest, she is as well. And Diana Belbita made her look like she didn't even belong. I thought Diana Belbita won this fight 30-27. I thought Maria Oliveira had nothing to offer on the feet. And she had no sense of urgency. She knew she was losing the fight in that third round. No sense of urgency. She was completely gassed. And when I see a fighter who's supposed to be an elite level fighter in the UFC with no gas tank, she gassed after like half of the first round. And there wasn't like some crazy high output. And, you know, I see a super sloppy striking. And then you compound that with the fact she has no grappling. And Diana Belbita is just busting her up on the feet. And then you look at her record. She's had 4 fights in the UFC. She's 1-3 in the UFC. She's on a 2-fight losing streak. In her last fight, she lost to Vanessa Demopoulos. And in that fight, she got dropped badly. And let's be honest, Vanessa Demopoulos is bottom of the barrel as well. So I think Maria Oliveira has no business being in the UFC. I mean, look at her in comparison to the rest of the women's strawweight division, which I know a lot of the time we crap on women's MMA, but the women's strawweight division is rather strong at the top. Imagine Maria Oliveira versus a Weili Zhang. Or, you know, a Rose Namajunas before she fell off the face of the earth. Can you imagine any of those matchups? Maria Oliveira, I don't think she has a future in the UFC, and I think the UFC probably will part ways with Maria Oliveira. Moving on to my number 2 cut after UFC 289, and this might shock a lot of you guys, but I think the UFC needs to cut Miranda Maverick. She's only on a 1-fight losing streak. I know people laugh when I say that. She's lost 1 fight against Jasmine Jadavicius. The performance was so poor, I think it's time to cut her from the organization. And a lot of people were getting behind the Miranda Maverick hype. And, you know, she got robbed against Macy Barber. And she only lost to Erin Blanchfield in the UFC. But this fight against Jasmine Jadavicius was atrocious. I mean, she won the first round. She landed a couple shots on the feet. And then they ended up on the ground. And Miranda Maverick kind of had an armbar situation for the majority of that round. So I gave the first round to Miranda Maverick. But after that, Jasmine Jadavicius just dominated the fight. Was outstriking her. Every time Miranda Maverick shot it on a takedown, it was from 100 miles away. She would get reversed, end up on bottom. So I don't understand what she was doing, but the grappling looked atrocious. Imagine every time you shoot in on a takedown, you're 100 feet away from your opponent, and every single time you're getting reversed and ended up on the bottom, and then you keep doing it. And then she knew she was losing the fight. She was gassed in the third round. Jasmine Jadavicius was just walking her down, throwing combinations, and just outstriking her. And in my opinion, I mean, that was some of the lowest MMA I've seen, lowest level MMA from Miranda Maverick since she's been in the UFC. I know the loss to Erin Blanchfield has aged very, very well, considering Erin Blanchfield is top of the division right now. But, you know, to lose to Macy Barber in a robbery decision, okay, we can forgive that because it was a robbery. She should have won that fight. But to lose to Jasmine Jadavicius, and even though she got the first round was kind of weird because of that armbar attempt, and it was kind of a stalemate. I think Miranda Maverick needs to go back to the drawing board. She needs to start over. She's only 25, so she can always come back to the organization. But, you know, in the flyweight division, I don't think she's going to have any success. I'm off the Miranda Maverick hype train, even though there really wasn't a hype train. But I had a little bit of belief in her future. I thought she was well-rounded enough. I thought she would win this fight. I'm not high on Jasmine Jadavicius at all, and she went out there and just pressed forward, was landing combinations, had the better gas tank, had the better grappling. So, I mean, she just outclassed Miranda Maverick, for lack of a better word. I think it's time for the UFC to cut Miranda Maverick from the roster. Moving on to my number one cut after UFC 289, and I think a lot of people are even going to disagree with this one, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is going to be a popular cut. The UFC needs to cut Blake Bilder after his performance at UFC 289. He fought Kyle Nelson on the prelims, and I expected Blake Bilder to win this fight. But the performance that he put on in that third round, I knew I had to cut him. I knew he was going to be the most important cut in this video because Blake Bilder was clearly losing the fight. The first round was very competitive. He got hurt in the first round, therefore losing the round because it was super close. I had him just barely edging out the first round, but then he got dropped towards the end. And then the second round, clearly losing, clearly getting out jabbed, clearly getting outstruck. Third round, same thing. He's gassing out a little bit, but not completely gassed out. And then in the third round, he's throwing spinning techniques. He's taunting. He's, going crazy, trying to rile the crowd up, and then not throwing any shots. He knows he's going to lose on the scorecards, but instead of actually trying to fight, he's throwing crazy spinning techniques and taunting at the crowd and taunting at his opponent and calling his opponent on and using that energy that he could be using to actually fight to do all that stuff. I think it was a horrible performance. He lost to Kyle Nelson. I thought this fight was a layup for him. I thought he should definitely beat Kyle Nelson. And, you look, he came off of Dana White's Contender Series, and I know the UFC kind of likes to baby those guys and say, oh, this guy came off of Dana White's Contender Series, and now he's a champion. Look at Jamal Hill, and kind of build the Dana White Contender Series guys up. But when I saw that third round, it just really irritated me. And then you had like the last 10 seconds where all of a sudden Blake Bilder gets a second win. And now that the horn's about to sound, you got this burst of energy to try to fight your opponent. That third round performance was one of the most embarrassing performances on all of UFC 289. And I think it was the most embarrassing performance because if you're not winning the fight, you're not throwing anything. And then when your opponent is off in the distance, you're throwing spinning heel kicks. When you have no will to throw any combinations, you're not throwing 2-3 punch combinations. I just think Blake Bilder needs to go back to the drawing board, to be honest. He needs to go fight somewhere else, get a couple wins. He's 32 years old. So he's supposedly entering his prime right now. So I have no hope. I will probably never be picking Blake Bilder again, depending on the opponent. And I don't think the UFC will cut him, but I think they need to. That performance in that third round, I know I keep harping on it, but when you're not winning a fight, you're clearly lost every single round. You clearly need a finish, and you're not throwing combinations, but you're saving up. You're saving up all your energy for spinning techniques that aren't going to land, and then you're showboating to the crowd. Really irritated me, and I want to see Blake Bilder cut from the organization. Now, I know I said that was my number one cut, but I do have another more specific or less specific cut from the organization after UFC 289 that I wonder, you guys are going to have to let me know down in the comments, do you agree with this or not? But my last cut from UFC 289 is not any fighter in particular, but the UFC needs to cut the entire women's bantamweight and featherweight division from the organization. Now, women's featherweight never existed. You go to UFC's website, there's no women's featherweights rankings. It's just Amanda Nunes is champion. So I'm sure they're going to get rid of women's featherweight. It doesn't exist. So I can't even name other women's featherweight fighters because the UFC would just pay bantamweights to go up to featherweight to fight Amanda Nunes. So it really just made absolutely no sense. But the women's bantamweight division, and I made a video about this a couple months ago, it's atrocious. And now Amanda Nunes retired. What are we going to have? Juliana Pena versus Raquel Pennington fight for the vacant bantamweight title? Ew, I don't want to see that. And you look at the rest of the division, you have Juliana Pena, Raquel Pennington, Holly Holm, Ketlin Vieira, Irene Aldana. Ew, this division's horrible. I mean, we're going to watch Holly Holm get her 17th undeserved title shot at this point. That's basically what we're looking at. And what is she, 42 years old? She's in her 40s. I don't remember exactly how old she is. Women's bantamweight is absolutely dead. And I would have no problem if the UFC just completely got rid of it. I think the women's strawweight division and the women's flyweight division are much better divisions. And the UFC has not prioritized building talent in the women's bantamweight division. And it shows because now Amanda Nunes is gone. If they dare try to headline a pay-per-view with a vacant women's bantamweight title fight, I'm not ordering that. I'm not watching it. I'm boycotting the card. That would be atrocious. Imagine Juliana Pena versus Raquel Pennington headlining a UFC pay-per-view card. So as long as they keep them out of main events, I don't want to see them in a fight night main event. I don't want to see them in a pay-per-view main event. Keep it around, that's fine. But if it was up to me, I'm looking at this division, and I'm looking at that poor performance Irene Aldana had, and she may be the next women's bantamweight champion. You may have very well watched the next women's bantamweight champion at UFC 289 get absolutely bludgeoned to death by Amanda Nunes. Because, honestly, Irene Aldana could beat Juliana Pena. She can beat Raquel Pennington. She was originally supposed to take on Raquel Pennington. I just think this division is horrible. I mean, look, Mayra Bueno Silva's number 10, ranked number 10 in the division. And even if you go look at the women's pound-for-pound rankings now, with Amanda Nunes gone, you're looking at Alexa Grasso as the number 1 pound-for-pound women's fighter. That's craziness to me. I think the UFC's got to do something. Maybe they get Valentina Shevchenko to go up to 135 and maybe become champion there again. I don't know what they do, because Valentina Shevchenko can easily become double champ now with Amanda Nunes gone. I always wanted to see Nunes versus Shevchenko 3, but unless they let Shevchenko move up and become double champion, I don't want to see women's bantamweight at all. I don't care about women's bantamweight. It's a horrible division. It's borderline skillless. It's just terrible. I mean, Juliana Pena's striking, I don't want to get on a whole rant here. Juliana Pena's striking is some of the worst striking I've ever seen in my entire life. But let me know what you guys think about all these cuts down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.